Hello, I'm Dr. Joseph Nunn, Professor Emeritus from the UCLA Department of Social Welfare. Back in the days when I was actually working, now that I'm retired, I was the Vice Chair for the department and the Director of Field Education. And as the Director of Field Education, a lot of my work involved placing students, working with students in agencies in and around the Los Angeles area. And during that time, I got to meet someone who we're going to focus on today, who is just outstanding in the field of social work. And that's Mr. Wilfred Coggins, also known as Bill. I will be referring to him as Bill throughout the interview. And I'm looking forward to talking with him. I know a lot of what his contributions are. Bill is sort of a Renaissance man. I'm sure I'm going to learn more about him as he begins to talk about his work in the Los Angeles area, specifically in Watts. Bill, I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what it was like growing up, and the kinds of things that stand out in your memory that were important to you, particularly those things that may have pushed you in the direction of a career in social work.
Well, I was born in New York City, actually in the Harlem section of New York City. Essentially, I was raised in a single mother family after about the age of 8. As you probably know, Harlem was referred to as a ghetto, a very restricted community. Once you left the unmarked boundaries, but yet quite definite boundaries of the ghetto, you were likely to face a certain amount of discrimination. And as a young person, perhaps some hostility or outright episodes of physical violence. In essence, the streets were not always very safe. As a young person, I essentially was a reader. I sort of retreated from the streets, but it's pretty hard to escape the streets. And as I've gotten older, I've had to admit that there's more street in me underneath all the educated layer than I've probably been willing to admit. But some of the things that encouraged me to, I know now that encouraged me to enter the field of psychiatric social work was, number one, of course, my first original and most crucial mentor was my mother. I could describe her as she's been described to me, as a one-woman social agency. She was always helping and supporting someone. Another relationship was my buddy's aunt, who at that time was an MSW. She had a master's degree in social work, I believe from Simmons. Of course, I didn't really know what that was all about. Her name was Etta Steele, and she went on later to establish an independent social work agency. She lived in one of the two best buildings on Sugar Hill in Harlem. She had a books library. She even recommended about 10 books to me to read. So she was definitely a very subtle, but probably a very powerful influence.
Bill, what was Sugar Hill? What was Sugar Hill?
Oh, Sugar Hill in Harlem was sort of the, I don't exactly want to call it the upscale section, but it was where most of the celebrities lived. A lot of musicians, actors. Belafonte lived around the corner. Poetry would come around. It It's probably started about 145th Street and continued up to about 163rd, 164th, and from probably the dividing line on the west side was Amsterdam Avenue, and on the east side, probably the Harlem River Drive, the East River. So it was mostly a section where people who wanted to be upwardly mobile tried to move. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I lived in so-called deep Harlem before, and I know now that my mother made a big effort to move us to Sugar Hill. Now that does not mean they weren't dangers and they weren't gangs, because I was in one, okay?
What was the name of your gang? You remember?
No, I don't remember the name of the gang. There were so many. I remember the names on the other gangs, but I don't remember the name of my gang. And probably one of the reasons I don't remember is because it was an incident that represented a turning point in my life. I now know. But my gang went on a counter raid to Deep Harlem. You know, we had the same kind of mentality as the guys in the projects have today. Well, you live over there, so you think you're better than me. You know, I don't even know you, but because you live here, I think you think this way, and you're going to treat me this way. So we would automatically fight with guys who lived in the valley. They would invade our territory. We would go on a counter raid to their territory. My gang was going on a counter raid to the valley in Harlem, but my mother was sick, and I guess was always sort of very alert to what was happening with my mother, because I could see she was working hard. I knew she was trying to survive, and I decided to stay home with my mother. Well, my gang went out on this counter raid, and during the counter raid, a guy in the other gang was killed. And the guy who, to this day I'm not sure who did it, but the guy who took the rap was Charlie Wheeler, our best fighter. And he was like the brawn in the gang, and I was like the brains, and I would be right beside him. And I always had a knife. So when that happened, and I found out that a guy had been killed, it's like, whoa, wait a minute.
So kind of a stroke of fate that you had stayed home.
Yes, I made the right decision. And so I think that probably contributed to my looking at the more constructive things in life, shall we say. How do you avoid conflict? How do you solve problems? You know, that was definitely not a direction I was going to go in. I can still, as you may hear in my voice, it's chilling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Almost crisis is danger plus opportunity. It's a push toward a different direction.
Yes, and then there were other mentors in my life in Harlem, many of the older people, particularly the ones who were succeeding to some degree. One of my buddies, Henderson Huggins, his mother was very fair, could pass for white, as most of the black school teachers in New York City looked at that time. She would come home from work. She's a heavy-set woman, very good-looking woman. And she'd come out of the subway. She'd look over and see me and say, "Willie boy, come here." And of course, in those days, you know, adults command you to come to them, you go. And she started talking to me. And at first, what the hell is she doing talking to me, you know? It took me years later to realize she was schooling me in a very subtle way. It got to be a routine. At first, I was apprehensive, is she going to discipline me? What did I do wrong, But there were many people like that in my early life. Basically, people workers, people helpers. in one way or another.
But they saw something in you, apparently. I mean, she took an interest in you.
Yes, well, she lived right in the building next door to ours.
Uh-huh.
And her son and daughter, and then her nephew, Freddie, they all lived in the same building. See, and so I mean, her nephew and her son was part of my crew.
Yes.
So,
Bill, were you a good student?
yes.
Yes, because
Yeah, I always loved school.
so you managed to, qualify for college.
Well, that's another story. Number one, when you talk about school, I started school in Barbados in the West Indies.
Okay.
And I must mention to you that in Barbados, the headmaster is a dictator. The parents do not challenge him, and the students will not challenge him. If you commit a behavioral infraction, if it's a minor one, he gets a heavy rule and cracks you across the knuckles. If it's a major infraction, he gives you his penknife for you to go out, cut a switch so he can switch you. So I think after my first minor infraction, I decided learning is the way to go.
So to set you on the right track.
Yeah, but I think that I know now that I've always liked to learn. I like being even though I was pretty much withdrawn as a kid, I was always active in the classroom. I loved the dialogue. I loved the report. I love learning from other students. Something about it that to this day I get turned on.
Now you went to college, but did you go in the military first, or did you go to college first?
Let me back up. I did not want to go to college. I got out of high school, Commerce High School, New York City, which no longer exists. I thought I wanted to go into business, which is very curious in view of what happened later on. But I got out of high school shortly before my 16th birthday, and that's when I was in the streets. Free at last, I thought, And my mother wasn't having that. She pulled out every weapon. She nagged me, she did everything. She stayed on my case to go to college. In order to pacify her, I started CCNY at night. City College of New York, which is a 4-year university, better known as the Harvard of the proletariat. So I started school at night and really got seduced into college once I met other students and, kind of sort of different people, and they had plans and so on. And that's how I ended up going to CCNY, from which I graduated in early 1949. Excellent school.
What was your major?
I was a psychology major.
Psychology.
I started out with an interest in English literature, with special psychology. I really need to mention, at some point around that time, I can't nail it down, in thinking about what I was going to do in order to support myself as a person, I definitely was thinking in that direction. I remember having the thought, people will always have problems. If you do something to help people with problems, you'll never be unemployed. But I clearly had that thought, and I was pretty young at that time as I look back on it. But I majored in psychology, got a degree, Bachelor of Science, in social science, and then what? I was lost. Like a lot of guys who completed, the 4 years of college, were not clear about what the next step. As fate would, I don't know if it's fate, but most of the guys that I knew throughout the city, black, white, indifferent, if you were sort of lost, there was a way station, New York City Department of Welfare, titled the job social investigator, and they did mean investigate. It's almost like if being poor was a crime, But what that did, it threw me out into the streets of New York as a very young person. And I covered the Bowery, Chinatown, Little Italy, East Harlem in the course of my different periods of employment with the New York City Department of Welfare. Because I worked there before I went into the Army. Worked there from 49 to when I was drafted in, I think it was September of 50. And then when I came out of the Army, I went back to welfare for about a year while I applied to the New York School of Social Work. Because while I was in the Army, I already decided I would go to grad school to get the Master's of Social Work degree. And by that time, I knew what MSWs did. Because in the Army, eventually, it's a long story, I worked in my second military occupational specialty, which was psychiatric social work technician. And I was sent out to South Fort Bliss in 1951. And out in South Fort Bliss were nothing but black troops, even though, as far as the United States public were concerned, the Army was desegregated in 1948.
I was going to say just recently segregated at that time.
1948 was supposed to be integrated,
Yeah.
but it was very erratic. And I was assigned to go out to South Fort Bliss. We were out in the boondocks Sunday, terrible conditions, to help the dispensary MD, like a primary care physician, reduce the sick call because some guys were faking it. So my job was to interview, screen the guys, do a social history, which was, in those days, very extended, and try to figure out who had a real illness or psychological complaint, and make a recommendation to my supervisor, who was an MSW, Captain Byrne, MSW from Boston, Lieutenant Eggleston, Lieutenant Bill Hill. And in those days, social workers were very chummy, very collegial. So I learned a lot about what it was like to be a master's degree level social worker while I was in the Army.
So how did you end up at UCLA?
That's a very interesting story. When I got out of the Army, I came out to LA to meet a buddy. We were going to party. He took off to San Francisco because he met a young woman. I went to the Watson Hotel over on Adams, still in my uniform. Coming off the road, I was greasy and looking terrible. They said, well, I think you need to go to that hotel on Jefferson. There was a little place called Max Motel, probably 8 or 12 rooms. It's probably part of USC's campus now. So I got myself a room there. I looked across the street. I thought, what the hell is this? This big building, University of Southern California. So at some point while I was partying and whatnot, I went across the street and got an application to, go to grad school at USC, which I filled out when I got back to New York. And they had some questions on the USC application, probably dealing with ethnicity, what did your father do? And I was super sensitive about it. And so I decided to look into UCLA, not only for that reason, but I figured out that with my GI Bill, I could only afford the New York School of Social Work for 1 year. It was an independent school, but the degree would come through Columbia. So I decided I'll go. Plus I had a buddy who had just moved out here. Plus I wanted to get away from my mother, wanted to strike out on my own. So economically, it was part of a plan, and I could do the 2 years. And it was cheaper, and it met my need to individuate and separate and have a little adventure. And plus I had seen LA, and coming from New York, seeing this pristine place and palm trees and the beach, I want some more of that. So that's how I happened to come out to UCLA. And I was only, a class of about 22 in my class. I was the only black.
And you were very close, though. I know at the 50th anniversary, you and some of your classmates came and spoke, and you even had a class song. You remember the class song?
No, but I've forgotten that you mentioned it, yes. I've forgotten that. Yeah, very lucky because I being such a small class, we got not only got excellent instruction, but we learned a lot from each other. We studied together. It was completely different. And something maybe I'll touch on later if we get to it. I think as a result of that early environment at UCLA's grad school, I think, and maybe at SC also, maybe in social work schools across the country, I think you had a concept of social work as a mission. And today I think perhaps, and I can't be sure because I've been not working for 20 years now, but sometimes I see it as just as many people come to social work to perform a service for a profession, and when they get into it, they may be very competent, but they don't see it as a mission. And I think there's a qualitative difference. Maybe I'm wrong, but
No, I tend to agree with you that it's kind of a calling.
You said the correct word, quality. You know, when I worked at Kaiser, I had a boss who was a PhD in public health from UCLA, Sharon Conroe, and she moved up. She didn't want to move up, but she got promoted to be vice president of quality out of national program offices in Oakland, Kaiser, because the company started to focus on quality. In fact, I remember we had a slogan, quality of care, quality of service. And I think that's true, that's needed, let's put it that way, when you're working with people. It's not only the service that you give, it's the care that you show.
Yes, yes. It makes a difference. Before we get to your time at Kaiser, I want to talk a little bit about, or you to talk about, some of the other things you were doing before you got to Kaiser. I know that you had a Fulbright scholarship at one point, and you also worked at a couple of different agencies.
Okay, I'll go through it rather rapidly. After my second year of field placement, when I was at UCLA School of Social Work, was at the VA Mental Hygiene Clinic, downtown Los Angeles, 1031 South Broadway. I didn't know it at the time, but it was probably one of the best psychiatric clinics in town. Fortunately for me, they wanted to hire me after I completed, my degree, and they did hire me. So I worked there until about April of '57, after graduating in '55 from UCLA. The only reason I left there is my mother got ill, and I went back to New York. I had a thing about working as a psychiatric social worker, because in those days we were very strict. I didn't want to get involved in a therapeutic relationship and then leave, because I knew it was temporary. So I worked as a medical social worker at Bellevue Hospital, even though at times I used some of the psychiatric social work skills. And I worked there, 4 or 5 months, and then I was on the list to work for California State Department of Mental Hygiene, Bureau of Social Work, called Manny Newman, who was in charge of the LA Bureau of Social Work. I said, Manny, I need a job. He said, you got one. Came back to work with the state and went for my job interview with Manny Newman. And he said, Bill, well, I really need you to work with the retarded. I said, oh, I don't want to do that, And he proceeded to give me sort of a sales talk. I thought he was conning me, but everything he said was accurate. He said, the Kennedys have a retarded child. They're going to put a lot of money in the program. It's going to look good on your resume. Try it for a year. If you don't like it, I'll move you. Okay? And of course, in those days, developmentally disabled children and adults were referred to as retarded. The hospital in Pomona was Pacific Colony. And I worked in what was called the PC unit, Pacific Colony unit, within the Bureau of Social Work. And as I've been looking back and thinking about this interview, that was really the beginning of one of the innovative programs I've been involved in my life. I've been involved in 3 innovative programs, pioneering programs. And I just recently discovered that in preparation and thinking about this interview. Because in the Pacific Colony unit within the Bureau of Social Work, we did everything. We worked directly with the children, teenagers, and adults to find them a placement in the community rather than remaining in the hospital. We found homes for them, either through family care homes with their families. Work placements were mostly in restaurants and sanitariums. And we would recruit family care homes. No, home care was for the real families. Family care were like foster parents. We would go out and find the foster homes, evaluate them, and even measure the house to make sure it conformed to what we needed. We did everything. It was a very innovative program, and we would supervise the kids, in the community. So that was one innovative program that I got involved with. From the state, I went to Wells Medical Group. I went private. It was a psychiatric clinic in Arcadia. I got an interview through one of my social work colleagues who was in grad school with me, Herbie Yamashita, good buddy of mine. Bless his soul, he's gone on now. Very good therapist and a very good friend. But I worked at Wells for about 4 years, from about February 60 to December 63. And in the meantime, while I was at Wells, I applied for Fulbright. And while I was waiting to hear from them, go through the process, I got a call from Bob Lippman, he's a psychoanalyst, medical director of Suicide Prevention Center. He was recruiting me. And I said, oh, I don't want to do that. Work with suicidal people? No, not me. And Bob proceeded to give me a sales talk. Bob was a genius, a very clever guy, an analyst who was never afraid to get his hands dirty. High respect for that man. But as a therapist, a master. Yeah. And I told him, I'd applied for a Fulbright. He said, well, you come and stay as long as you want to. It probably look good when you go over there with your Fulbright. So I said, okay. So that was the second innovative program I was involved in. And working at that place, I don't know how to, there were so many bright people. The work was so challenging. You learned so much. Every day was like a rush, an academic rush, an experiential rush, a collegial rush. The interaction with the clients, the patients, your colleagues, the consultants, the people you train as clinical associates. It was just a very stimulating job. So much so that after all, various of us left for various reasons. We met for lunch for God knows how many years, every Thursday, because we had formed this bond. So luckily for me, I got the Fulbright, ended up going to Tavistock, and that is something I could talk about for a long time. I'll just say this, 3 components. Number one, I lucked out on my tutor, Allison Lyons. She was a Jungian lay analyst. But She had the academics and stuff, but what a human being. Such a humane person. Just fantastic. I lucked out, you know. Plus, I got most of the people I trained with at Tavistock were MDs, but they're from all over the world, you know. Germans, had an Israeli psychologist, woman. Just, and I had fantastic experiences. I know we have a limited time, but I will have to mention one thing that I experienced there. Actually, through my tutor and through her husband. Just very brief. My tutor's husband, Sam Lyons, was a solicitor, represented a lot of famous people in this country and overseas. Arthur Murray in this country, Sinatra, Shirley Bassey over there, Malcolm McDowell, so on and so forth. Sinatra sued the tabloid press who presented his son's kidnapping as a publicity stunt, and he won. And when Sam, my tutor's husband, asked Sinatra what to do with the money, send it to you, Sinatra allegedly said, "You keep it and use it for good causes." Well, the adult educational center at the Leicester University in the Midlands of England and the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which was a part of Tavistock, but the non-British Health Service part of it, more the private part of it, they would put on an annual learning and leadership conference. And Leicester, by the way, is Leicester University. It was either a week or two, I don't remember. I'd have to look at my papers. But it was the best conference I've ever been to in my life. And it would take me a little time to describe it. There were about 70 people divided between business people, English Ford, Imperial Chemical Industries, etc., and then people in the people helping field, psychologists, psychiatrists, people from probation in England, from the prison system, but 70 all told. This conference provided you with 3 different modalities of learning. One was the total conference body of 70 people. Give you an example. We had 3 analysts, they call themselves consultants. We're in a big, like amphitheater room, like a conference, a college lecture room, big, to hold all those people. The 3 consultants sat in a triangle, one guy there, one guy here, one guy there, at the lowest level. And depending on how comfortable you felt, you either sit in the back or you sit towards the front. It was almost diagnostic. Here were the instructions they gave us. The purpose of this group is to study the group's behavior. That's it.
You study your own behavior.
Yeah. How are you going to do that? Behave, right? In brief, what happened, the business guys, all of whom were management guys, practically, they tried to get organized, right? What would happen? Somebody would sabotage them. Criticize this, and that was the pattern. This was conflict, chaos,
So a real opportunity to look at process and how things were unfolding in that group.
So that was one modality. I could talk more about that, but I know we have time. Then we had an intergroup exercise. Again, we were put in a big room and given some ambiguous instructions. And depending on how you interpreted the instructions would depend on what room you would go to. And the room you would go to, you would become a member of that group. And then your task was to relate to other groups because it's an intergroup exercise. Fascinating process. The other application was a study group, which was more like group therapy. About 12, I think, of us in the group. Then the last group was the application group, which I was fortunate to be in one with Margaret Riot, who's a PhD clinical psychologist from the National Training Laboratories in New England, because it was an international conference. But that was the Leicester conference, and boy, You talk about learning, you know. I mean, bam. There's so much I could say.
So how long were you there in England?
I was there for an academic year, and then traveled all over Western Europe. I think I was gone a total of about 16 months, something like that. Yeah. But it was a very rich experience. And I should mention also, I worked with other social workers, one of whom was trained in this country. Not only did I work with them and socialize with them, but everybody that I worked with invited my first wife and I to their cottage. Because here's the system. Everybody that I worked with had a flat or some living arrangement in London. But at the same time, they had a cottage or a house they were buying somewhere in the country, Suffolk or Essex or wherever, okay? And every one of the people I worked with invited us to their country cottage. Now, my tutor, she described it as a cottage. She said, Bill, if you and Mary come and spend the weekend with Sam and I at a little cottage by the sea. We went down there, this big building, bathrooms with every, because in England, bathrooms almost with every bedroom. That's unheard of almost. Well, yeah, needless to say, they had money, right? And, but the thing about socializing, they people invite you, spent the weekend. It wasn't like you just went for an hour visit. And the first time, and I remember going to Allison several times, and sometimes it would not be just us, but other couples, and people would form alignments, talk depending on interests, and if you and I resonate, we go off and talk in the gardens or wherever. I mean, I never experienced anything like that before or since.
Yeah, quite a bit different from Harlan, huh?
We hardly let anybody in the house. Visitor? What are you talking about, visitor? You better call first.
So how long were you there total?
Overseas about 16 months.
16 months. You did say 16 months.
Yeah, I have a lot of other experiences traveling.
Right.
But that gets into another area.
Right. So when did the Kaiser Permanente Foundation come into play?
Well, I bought a car in Europe, drove cross country, and in the meantime, while we were overseas, we had rented out our house. Actually, the two classical musicians who taught at Mount St. Mary's. I can't even think of their names. I can see them. But we came back and said, hey, we got this note for you. And it was from two of my colleagues. Sophie Poster, she's the one who recommended that book, by the way, and Shirley Hook. Both of us had worked for the California State Department of Mental Hygiene. And they left this note saying, we got the perfect job for you. And so I said, oh, what's this, But I followed up, and I said, and I went and spoke to Dr. Green, Dr. Edward L. Green. He was the second regional chief of psychiatry for Kaiser, and to Helen Stout, who was the chief social worker, who I knew. She used to be the chief social worker at the State Mental Hygiene Clinic. And, they told me that the company wanted to do something in the black community. It was called the Watts Project. It had a history, which would take me a little time to get into. And I would be the guy who would implement it, try to define it, implement it. So I said, okay. I didn't really believe it. I went and looked about other jobs. And I decided, this is something that really needs to be done. I'll give it a couple of years,
Wasn't there someone from SC that was involved with the original conception of the program? And looking at your bio, I think I recall someone from USC had begun to sort of look at the project at another site.
No, I don't. I can't.
We can come back to that.
Yeah,
if it occurs.
Somebody from SC?
Yeah, I think there was somebody. Yeah, one of the faculty people from SC. But anyway, let's move
No,
along.
I can't remember that. I knew somebody from UCLA, Jeanette Alexander.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm thinking about. She was at UCLA.
UCLA, yeah.
Got it.
Jeanette Alexander.
Right.
Yeah, there had been a previous effort to implement the so-called Watts project, and they were
Okay, that's what I'm thinking about.
right. They were going to develop a therapeutic preschool. That was their project, and that again has an interesting genesis, which I don't think we have time to get into.
Okay, what do you remember about this is moving into the 60s then. What do you remember kind of that stands out around the early to mid 60s, around Los Angeles and what was happening with the
The 60s. The 60s, see the movie Easy Rider to get a sense of the mood of the 60s. To me, that's a movie that helps to define the 60s. Basically speaking, people helpers like myself, people who were social activists, people who believed in social justice, etc. We thought we were going to change the world. That was the mood. We were coming up with programs. Again, it was like a mission. We were dead serious. And all sorts of people had all sorts of visions about which kind of program to develop to tackle a particular problem. And so there were a lot of different efforts. And there were some companies who developed community service programs that they would fund. TRW had one. Catholic Healthcare West, which had a whole network of hospitals, had a program called Social Accountability, and so forth. So that was the mood. And of course you had the militant part of it with Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, all those people
Black
really
Panthers,
came to Watts.
Yeah. Malcolm X. You know, it's kind of interesting that when I think about the 60s, as you're talking about it, it was a time of tremendous hope, but also civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, some key assassinations had taken place during that decade, and yet it's in the midst of all that you kind of began your work with Kaiser in the Watts community.
Well, I think you've put your finger on something. There was probably an element of guilt operating within me when I decided to take the job. And that played into my feeling that I know it needs to be done. Because when the revolutionary civil unrest occurred in Watts, I was in New York on my way overseas. And my best buddy was a deputy sheriff. And I talked to him on the phone while he was in Watts during that period. And I'd never forget his words, because we'd been in the streets of New York.
Yes.
So he said, "Man, this is the closest thing to war that I've ever been in." That was like, whoa. And I'm hoping, I hope he survives, you know.
Yeah. It was touch and go.
Yeah. So I think in me, the feeling that I was someplace else when the action was going on.
Yes.
You know, that was somewhere operating, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah. I said, but I was still gonna do both. Oh, I'll give you 2 or 3 years. But I'm gonna do my thing. My thing was I was gonna go into private practice, felt I was well equipped, et cetera, et cetera.
Surprise, huh?
Surprise.
Yeah, the Watts Rebellion, I remember being on the roof of my dad's house with a hose as, White Front on Central Avenue was burning and embers were flying everywhere. And, it was in the midst of or following actually the rebellion, that you actually started to work your efforts in the Watts community. Tell me a little bit about that.
Say that
again. Take a deep breath.
Say that again.
Following the Watts Rebellion, you began your work in the Watts community, and tell me a little bit about how you got started.
Yeah, I have to take a second breath on that, because here's the context. You got to remember now, I had been away from the States. And being away from the States, your worldview changes. I didn't mention that before. But also, when you come back, you're disoriented. I've been adjusting to a different culture. I've had to make a switch. I drive across country. I come from the East Coast to the West Coast, and within a month, I'm in a job in a place I've only probably been in once or twice. I'm talking about Watts. I remember going there once looking for a certain record at a Tobacco Road shop. I still remember the place, little hole in the wall. So I'm like a babe in the woods. What's going on? What's happening? But a very important thing had happened when I was away. And that is, in general, when I left, professionals were sort of the last word in dealing with community problems. We were the experts. We were the academics. We sort of knew what was happening. But when I came back, it was all about the community having input, the community having power. And it didn't take long for me to pick up on that. So, your question is, how did I get started? I started first by connecting to people that I knew in the field, whether they were social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists. At the time, you have to remember this, the mental health community was relatively small. And so I knew a lot of people, or I knew of people. And then there were some meetings like, what was it called? Tom Alwan. It was like like United Way, but an overseeing body, there's a name for it I can't think of. And we would meet regularly to survey the problem area. You're doing this, you're doing that. So first I networked with the people that I knew, the professionals, who would point me to community people that I should relate to. For instance, Dr. Elsie Georgie from UCLA School of Social Work.
Yes, knew her well.
Yeah. She said to me, I clearly said, look, one person you need to tip your hat to, that's how she put it, is Eva Bradford Rock. He said she's the person who heads up the extended daycare program at Compton Avenue School. She may have nothing to do with what you're trying to do, but you better tip your hat to her. Otherwise, she's going to badmouth you. So that's an example of how I had to figure out who were community influence people, who were community leaders, and how to at least, introduce myself to them, give them a chance. The same thing with the governmental structure. The council was Councilman Gibson at the time. Justin Howard was his chief deputy, and he was like the city council man in the area. You didn't mess with them, okay? You had to go by Judson, Yeah, so it's like learning a whole new landscape. Then there's the school situation, and I was lucky with this penetrating LA Unified, and that really happened through Dr. K. Dr. Raymond K. was the founding regional medical director of Kaiser here in Southern California. And Ray had a friend, Dr. Gordon Goodhart, who was a psychoanalyst. I think he had been the dean of medicine here at USC, but had a midlife change of profession. Very smooth, very urbane dude. He was conducting mental health consultation with principals in Southeast LA. And so Ray hooked me up with him. And I got into this group of principals who at first were very suspicious of me. You know, not on the surface, but it didn't take me long to figure out these guys think I'm a spy, you know. It didn't take me long. But I earned their trust, and as a matter of fact, I wrote the final report. So that gave me entry into the school system, okay? So that was kind of like being lost, but now I'm found, you know.
Yeah.
I had to find my way. And almost symbolic of that, I came back, I was dressing pretty Ivy League, the tie and all that. When I would go to corporate and go to Hollywood, where corporate office was at the time, I'd put back on my tie. After all, I'd put the tie in my pocket. After all, I got rid of the tie. After all, I got rid of the jacket. And made that switch. But I was related to two worlds, more than two worlds. The children, the parents, community leaders, the school system, the whole corporate structure, and some others I can't even think of at the moment.
And as I recall, you had an office on Sunset, and yet you spent a lot of your time out in the community.
Yes, I had an office in the 4900 building at Sunset in Vermont. And so when I would go into the community, I would work out of my car. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I got a car from the company very early. I don't remember what I was driving. I think I only had a car of my own for about a month, but then I got a car from the company. And by the way, I didn't ask for it. I was so stupid I didn't even think about asking for a car. They came to me.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, but that was part of there was a lot of pressure on me to get this thing done in a hurry, which I resisted. And I began to become aware of some economic realities of how things can be done in the hood, but the money goes out of the hood. And so when I saw that operating, but I resisted, And I will say this, I was able to resist, and as Jim Vose, who later became chairman of the board for Kaiser nationally, talked about something that I wrote. He said that was a bold move. I was bold, and I could afford to be bold, because I had my own income. So I had other income. And I had the education, I had the experience. I knew I was a hard to find commodity. So I rode that horse. In other words, don't screw with Bill Coggins. Give me what I need.
He's a bad man.
You haven't seen bad men till you see upper management in a large corporation. You haven't seen any bad men.
Yeah.
You haven't seen it. You haven't seen it.
These are people that were not in the community. They were outside.
I'm talking about the guys who run the corporation.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the guys who sit at the high rise making the decisions that filter down and everybody got to fall in line. And these guys, you don't think they just hired me and just let me run and do which they did, but you don't think they were looking over my shoulder? You didn't think I had endless scrutiny? I'd be a fool to think I was just doing what I wanted to do. And no, I could give you many. One, I think I've said this before at other events. I had to speak before Edgar Kaiser. Now he's not directly related to the health plan, but he is. But he had to have an opportunity to look me over. All the guys in senior management sure did. Dr. Clifford Keene, who was chairman of the board of Kaiser nationally. By the way, his address was 1 Pebble Beach Drive. He came down to Watts when I was in a one-room building with gravel on the ground and said, "Now, Bill, just pretend I don't know anything about this project and tell me what you're doing."
you were dealing with pressure from the community as well as from the corporate offices.
Exactly.
And so from all sides. It's kind of interesting, you mentioned the building that was there. Now, today, at the corner of 103rd and Success in Watts, is a beautiful facility. The Kaiser Watts Center for Child and Family Learning Center.
Counseling and Learning Center.
Counseling and Learning Center. But it wasn't always there. Tell me about how that got started. The kind of, well, you had no facility in the back of your car at first, and now, then you're talking about the place with the sort of gravel yard.
How are we doing time-wise?
We're okay.
Okay. My first ask was to try to find some place to hang my hat to operate out of. Because you got to remember that in 1965, a lot of buildings were burnt up in Watts, so there was very, very little shelter available. USC, as a matter of fact, was the delegate agency for the, what was it called? South Central Multipurpose Health Services Center, something like that. I remember the word multipurpose. It was a part of the Warren property, was out of the Office of Economic Opportunity. But the grant was overseen by USC. Okay. And they had a prefab building, 30 by 32. And they had in that building a community expediter. I've forgotten Jim's title. His name was Jim Bates. Black dude, big dude, football playing dude, who deliberately fractured his English so he could relate to the street toughs. But USC had that building in order to establish what they call program presence. In other words, they positioned themselves. And after they built a bunch of other prefabs across the street, and so they gave up the one-room building, and I proceeded to try to take it over. Well, lo and behold, that was very interesting. Seemed simple. What I found out, there was so many business transactions that occurred as part of establishing the center. But what I found out was that the land was owned by a local minister, Apostle Stewart. The building was owned by a company called Design Facilities, which was a subsidiary of Aerojet General, one of the aerospace companies that I was familiar with from working at the psychiatric clinic in Arcadia, because that was one of the few aerospace companies that had a psychiatric inclusion in their health insurance policy. So I had to negotiate with two entities, Design Facilities, really Aerojet General, and the local minister. Well, the business guys I did okay with. The minister gave me a run for my money. He was very evasive, and I couldn't understand why he was giving me the runaround. Went to his house one day. His wife said he wasn't there. I don't know whether he was or not. As I walked away, I looked back at their house, and I noticed they had some siding. And I said, "Oh, that's some nice siding you have on the house." And she reacted sort of negatively. And I said something like, "What's the matter? You don't like it?" She said, "Oh, we had some trouble with the people who installed it." She said it was Kaiser aluminum. And boy, it's like a light bulb went on. I turned around and I explained the difference to her between Kaiser Health Plan, Kaiser Foundation, and Kaiser Aluminum. Sooner or later, the minister and I connected, deal was solved.
You're a community organizer in addition to being a psychiatric social worker.
Yeah, so we had that building for about a year, and immediately I started looking for another building. Something I did not mention, Kaiser had gotten about $40,000 contributed towards this project from Ruth Conti. Ruth Conti was an MSW who had been married to Richard Conti, the movie star. And they had 3 lots on 66th and 67th. I think it's near Maine. It's near where what's the name of that school for kids who were unruly, who didn't fit into the Jacob Riis.
Yes, I remember Reese.
Yeah. It was just close to that school. I think it was a little east. It was practically next door to that school. And so I could have used that to locate the project, but I wanted to be in Watts proper. Because I had that money, so I immediately started looking for additional property, and I saw the present location, which was about 4 double units, two units front and back in each one, two bedroom apartments front and back, and there were 4 buildings. With the first area was an empty lot, right in the corner of 100 Success and 103rd. Just by serendipity, one of my buddies from New York was an accountant. He was president of Family Savings and Loan. And I told him what I was doing. And he said, Willie, I think we carried the loan on that property. I said, find out, So he found out for me, and they carried the paper. So the company used an approach. They had a broker from Beverly Hills buy the empty lot, and I bought the double unit. First, I had to approach the people in double units, and fortunately for me, the woman that was right next door to the empty lot was the person who was interested. Because the guy with the sky cap at the airport, he wanted to move closer. He wanted to move to Inglewood. Yeah. And so that was the deal. So that's how we ended up in that location. Once we were in that location, we were then in the Watts Redevelopment Project number 1 area, and we were designated an owner participant. So that $40,000 was used to buy the lot, which cost about $12,000, and the double unit was about $23,500, which I bought. I was the shill. And then, of course, I reconveyed it to the company. I don't even remember the mechanism. I remember the bank I went to, Bank of America on Robertson and Wilshire. Yeah, but that's how we ended up in that location, and became part of the whole redevelopment process.
And from that beginning, I remember probably around 1980, I was involved in placing perhaps your first MSW intern at the Kaiser Watts Learning Center. I'm going to say center from now on. And, it was an impressive place. Tell me a little bit about some of the programs that you offered and developed over the years.
Ooh.
Give me just a few examples.
We started, I started out with a group of, when I was still in the one-room building, started out with a group of about 22 kids who were referred from 3 elementary schools in the area, by some of those same principals that were in Dr. Gordon Goodhart's group. That's why I say I got penetration to LA Unified directly. And those were kids who were described as having either behavior problems, learning problems, or a category that I came up with, leadership potential, which I later changed to leadership problems once I got grounded. So out of that initial group came sort of a counseling program we call personal development. While we were still in that one-room building, I became aware of the fact that some of these kids had educational problems. And I asked them questions. Everybody admitted to having problems with math, but nobody admitted to having problems with reading, though they obviously did. So I got a education psychologist to volunteer and slowly recruited her to be on staff, Susan Dunn. So we started out basically with a counseling program and an educational program, both of which, were developed further. The educational program became educational therapy to work with kids with educational differences or educational Let me turn this thing on. Educational difference, educational disabilities, or some educational problem in a targeted area. You know, you might be bright otherwise, but have trouble in this or that area. So that was educational program. Then once we got the double units, we started a small preschool program out of the garage that we converted. Well, we thought we were stepping in high cotton. Garage is about 17 by 22, something like that. Kaiser fixed it up real nice. You know, Kaiser has marvelous workmen. And so we started a preschool in 1971 out of that program. See if I can remember all of the programs. Sometime later, through Joanne Robinson, who later became director, we developed a SAT preparation program in conjunction with the Princeton Review, developed a partnership with them. And this continues until this day.
I think what's important to note also is that, you know, Kaiser Permanente, the Health Foundation, is a member organization, but the services offered at the center were for the whole community,
Yes.
whether they were Kaiser members or not.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm glad you mentioned it. Yes, yes. The so-called WATCH project was described then as a community service program. Now it will be called a community benefit program, because Kaiser supports and has partnerships with a variety of organizations, from like the Crenshaw Y, a health education program at Holman Methodist Church, and so forth. Yes. Another program that we developed came out of a conversation between myself and my boss at the time, Sharon Conroe. She would say, Bill, counseling is fine, but people need a job. So we developed a program called the Youth Work Preparation Program to help high school students make the transition from school to work. And that program was headquartered at the Kaiser Bellflower Medical Center. So, of course, we had to get buy-in from the medical director and other people in senior management at the Bellflower area. And that program continues until today. It was very interesting, particularly helping kids understand what it's like to work in a large corporate structure, a healthcare structure, some of the considerations from relationship to supervisors, understanding of what represents, sexual harassment, because how to dress appropriately. So that program has been very successful. Like I say, continues to today, and it's quite needed because I was one of the few men around staff, so they would have me come over, teach some of the guys how to tie ties and other male-oriented skills that they needed. And it kind of opened my eyes because a lot of those guys never had a suit. They didn't know what it was. I was like dumbfounded, Tie a tie? I mean, I thought everybody knew how to tie a tie. I was just amazed at what a lot of these guys did not know.
Yeah, in social work they say start where the client is, and that's what you did. You started out with some very basic information. What about Kids Can Cope?
Yeah, Kids Can Cope is I'm gonna have a hard time with this one because Kids Can Cope stemmed from Gilda's death. Gilda Edmonds, who was a very good nurse, later became a teacher at 102nd Street School, one of the schools that I worked with from the beginning. The principal was Owen Knox. Gilda was a very good friend of mine. She was married to one of my New York buddies. Everybody in our social group knew she was a special person. She was a confidant for a lot of people, including me. But she developed aplastic anemia, treated by Kaiser. I saw her at Sunset. I still have a hard time with her death because she was such a beautiful person. But after she died, a group of her friends got together because her death reverberated with me, and she had 3 kids. And reverberation is not even the correct word. It had a hell of an impact on them. Which in the long run came out okay. In fact, her son's a doctor, interestingly. But a group of Gilda's friends got together to form a program to help kids deal with the impact of cancer in the family. Because when someone gets cancer, if it's an adult, often the kids are unintentionally ignored. They don't know what the hell's going on, and they begin to act out. The grades start to drop. They're signs of emotional dysfunction. So we worked on developing this program. We started applying for a grant. We got one from the American Cancer Association. It's called the Macomba Legacy Foundation, I believe. They gave us about $15,000 for 3 years. And out of that, we were able to hire a part-time person, Marlene Beckles, later Marlene Wilson. She was an employee of the Watts Health Foundation, and once we got her to come over, she was employed by Drew, but physically was placed at the center. Eventually, Kaiser took over the program. That's all I'll say about that. And again, that program continues. It's expanded to the fact that it deals not only with the impact of cancer, but of any life-threatening illness on children in the family. And it's located now at the center in Watts, Kaiser, West LA. I think, what used to be Bellflower is now in Downey. And I think they also have it at Harbor, Kaiser Harbor. I think it's about 4 locations. So that's another innovative program that came out of the center. And I helped out with that program a lot, again, not only because I was the male, but as you can tell, I had strong emotional.
Personal investment.
Yeah. I worked a lot to deal with the problems and the barriers to keeping that program afloat. I fought like crazy.
One of your events that really struck me is that at the end of each academic year, you would honor the children at different stages of their success, whether it was elementary school, middle school, or high school, or college, which some of your kids did go on and get degrees. But you also included the MSW interns who were graduating, who by that time you had interns from the different programs in Los Angeles. And those events to me were very, very warm, and I remember some of the kids were really talented. They would perform, and it struck me. And I remember you saying that you don't just honor them at the end of when they're finishing high school, you make sure you recognize them along the way. And I think that was a good lesson to the parents.
Well, we honored the children as they moved from one level to another. We honored the parents if they somehow did something to improve their education. We not only honored the social work interns from the various universities as they proceeded up the ladder, we also honored staff. As you know, I was always on somebody's tail to advance themselves. So it was motivational, it was public recognition, it was role modeling. You could see the next step. Hey, there's so-and-so. He's graduated from high school, he's from my hood. You could see it. You didn't have to preach it, you could see it. So those were some of the reasons. And it's curious that the Social Work Hall of Distinction program is going to be at that very same hotel.
Is that right?
The Marriott. We used that for so many years when I was director. So when I found out you were using that hotel, it just brought back all kinds of memories. You know?
An interview about the center wouldn't be complete unless I ask you, tell me something about Sweet Alice.
Sweet Alice Harris. Well, what I can tell you is somewhat limited. Let me start. Sweet Alice really referred herself to be a member of the core mothers group. That group of mothers who had kids regularly involved in our program and who came to me and said they wanted a group of their own. I facilitated the group. It was not group therapy. They talked about their daily lives. I facilitated the group to make sure one person didn't monopolize, to sometimes echo comments, etc. Sweet Alice very aggressively wanted to be part of that group, became part of that group. And that's how I first connected with her. But there's much more personal. Sweet Alice had an older daughter who died. There's a lot more to it, but that's about all I can say. And when her daughter died, she called me that very day. She was at her daughter's house, same block that she lives. And I went, I've had 2 experiences working as a therapist or in this field. And that day was one in which something happened and somebody called on me and I'm saying, what the hell am I gonna do inside? I've had one other situation, but I went down there and I can't even remember all of, and I don't really particularly want to go into all of what happened, but that's kind of part of her motivation. In fact, I know a lot more, but I can't say. But that's my, Sweet Alice and I have I'll give you, the best way I could describe it is in 2003, I was in New York for 6 months. My brother was sick. And at one point he was in a convalescent home across the street from Central Park. And I had left from visiting with him and I was walking along Central Park waiting to catch the bus. It's cold and I was kind of down and depressed. My cell phone rang. A voice said, so you thought you could get away from me? It was Sweet Alice.
Oh my.
And we just talked our talk. And she picked up how I was feeling, you know. And that gives you an idea of the connection. Well, even now, you know, there's another layer of communication between us because we have a history that we don't talk about, but we know exists. And as you know, she's gone on to be a full-blown community activist.
Yes, very well known. Written up in the LA Times.
Oh, yes. Yeah, but there's some deeper stuff. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
You know, I'm trained as a therapist, and I know when to keep my mouth shut.
Yeah. Hey, and that's important.
Yeah.
You know, one of the questions I was going to ask you was, how did your social work skills help you in your success? And yet you've told us all along the way, you've mentioned how you as a social worker have relied on sort of the ethics and values of the profession and how they have guided you. Is there anything else that you would like to say about that?
Yes. When you're working in a corporate situation, you're working in a bureaucratic situation. And fortunately for me, I have worked in a lot of bureaucracy before working for Kaiser Permanente. I mentioned I worked for the New York City Department of Welfare when I was very young. That was my introduction to bureaucracy. I mentioned I worked for the VA. There's some stuff I could tell you about that. Even though we worked in a fairly small section of the VA, that was much more aligned with social work values, psychiatric values, it still was bureaucracy. Then I went into the Army, Oh, I've been in the Army. That was a bureaucracy. Okay. And of course, I came to Kaiser. And as a social worker, and as a person who had worked as a therapist, you're constantly looking at behavior. Not only overt behavior, but covert behavior. You're looking at interconnections between people. You're looking at networks that exist within a corporation. That nobody's going to tell you there's this network. You've got to discover it yourself. But first, you got to be alert to the fact that, hey, networks operate, you know. But one of the biggest things is that as a psychiatric social worker who has experience as a therapist, you're constantly observing behavior. And one of the things I didn't mention, as a child, very early I learned, I was kind of the family detective, so I learned how to be a participant observer. Very young in life, for whatever reasons. So in a corporate situation, you have to learn how to read behavior and anticipate what's coming down the pike. And boy, they carried the day many a day. Okay? You learn, one of the biggest things, I think you learn self-examination as a social worker. You know, so I think I knew this personally, but even more strongly, when you're in a job, you have to fulfill a role, whatever your role is. Not only was I director of a center, but I had a staff of people who were depending on me. So I could not indulge myself sometimes by getting angry and going off half-cocked. Give you an example. Let's say I wanted something from corporate. I write a memo. No response. I call. I get the runaround. Do I get on the phone or try to get a hold of the guy and get angry? No. Here's what I would do. I'd jump in my car, drive to Pasadena, where the corporate headquarters is, go into that guy's office and say, hey, Joe, and make some off-the-wall joke. Whatever occurred to me. And the guy would say something like, Bill, I know I owe you some answers, or, oh, you know, he'd say something. But I don't have to say anything. I know at that point I have what I want. I don't have to say anything. I know I got it. And every time, that's what happened. What am I going to do? Oh, you didn't call me? You didn't do this? You didn't do this? Blame game? Hell no. I want my objective. My objective is to get what I need.
That's a good example of your use of self-awareness too.
Yeah.
Recognizing that I am angry at this point. I need to put that aside.
Exactly.
And do something different.
But, you know, you're representing so many people. When you, in a project like I was in, like I said, it was all this scrutiny. Don't think it just went away and evaporated. I mean, we were a small community service program, but with high visibility. As I said before, we're carrying the company's flag, loud and high.
And high influence in that community too. Now, you were a good role model too. What I remember walking behind you one day is we're going to your office, and I observed you picking up paper along the way and putting it in the trash, and I thought, wow, that says a whole lot about, you know, just from the very basics all the way to...
Oh, let me tell you about that. I had a staff member who was supposed to police the front of the building. And he gave me static, you know, repeatedly. I said to myself, screw so-and-so. I ain't got time for this. I got all this other stuff to deal with. So I would go out front, because I do that on my rental properties. Actually, I'll tell you how that has paid off for me. So I would go out front and do that. One day I'm out there policing the front of the area. This black woman comes up to me and says, hi. I said, hi. She said, we need more people like you. I said, what do you mean? She said, we know who you are. I live across the street in the project, and we've been watching you. I said to myself, I'm doing PR, I don't even know it.
That's it, a role model for social workers and for the community of Watts, for the Kaiser Foundation. Just an incredible career. And as I've listened to you speak, your recall of names and places, to me, is phenomenal. You are, how old, Bill? You comfortable saying it?
Huh?
How old are you?
Oh, no problem. I'll be 92 in February.
92 years old.
92 in February.
In February, with that kind of recall, your memory of details,
Yeah.
for me, is phenomenal.
Well, it's only as I've gotten older that I realize, and that I have accepted, I guess, that I have been gifted with for most of my life I didn't know it. Most of my life I never, except that Tom Peters, who was my student at suicide prevention, we still meet for lunch. One time he said, well, man, he said, you're also kind of proud of your memory. I was proud of my memory, but I didn't realize it was exceptional. I mean, I'd say maybe 5 years ago I began to realize that. And I've been retired now 20 years. But I guess, particularly in preparing for interviews like this, you begin to survey your life. And I'm starting to realize how many assets I was given or that I developed. And I kind of say, is that you? I mean, if you knew me as a kid, I'd be the last guy you would think would be like that. I was a quiet kid.
Well, you say that, and yet I remember you, the woman that called you out, the school teacher, and said some things to you. Somebody saw something, Bill.
Yeah, but I was, so I, like I said, I'm very grateful, and I mean, so many positive things have happened to me. There's so many people who have helped me. When I was in elementary school, I hung around with some immigrant kids. One was a French guy, Laing. He'd always have a few books. We'd have and he carried them like this. And he walked sort of this erect, just like floating. But he was like my guidance counselor. He told me what to do. I got skipped and so on. And there was a German guy I hung around with too. And it wasn't until probably in the late 70s that I discovered why I resonated to these guys. There was a song called The Immigrant. Sedaris, there's a singer, I can't think of his name, but I really like that song. Then one day it hit me. The reason you like that song, because you see yourself as an immigrant. You're the first generation, of an immigrant mother. Because when I grew up in Harlem, coming from a West Indian family, there was prejudice within the black community. You know what they call the West Indians? Monkey chaser. And the biggest one was black Jews.
Really?
You know why they call us black Jews? Work hard, save your money, buy property.
Oh.
I mean, as a kid, I didn't know, but as I got older, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, kids can be rough.
Oh yeah, well you're different, and I don't know if I know even today there's certain words I'll say that I can hear the West Indian accent. Maybe the other person, but I hear it. And I would imagine that as a small, because my mother never lost hers, so I'm sure that I had some residuals,
Tell me, as we sort of wind down, I was watching the Rose Parade January 1st, 2018, and I was struck by a float. Tell me about that float.
Oh, the Kaiser float?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I could tell you very much about it.
It featured the Kaiser Watch Counseling and Learning Center.
Yeah, it represented the center. I'm trying to think of how that came about. I know I got a call. I was on the committee. I really can't remember.
But I do want to say that what occurred to me is I know that guy. I know the guy, the founder of that organization, the one that really brought it, nurtured it into its current status in the community. And it's because I knew you that I thought, wow, look at that.
Yeah, they wanted me to write on the float, but I declined. And the reason I went out to several events, and I'm sure glad I declined, because I probably would have gotten pneumonia.
Early in the morning, huh?
Well, it's very cold, and you were out there exposed. I would have to have been dressed very well. Plus, I don't know physically whether my body would hold up with all that. I just knew instinctively that's not something I think I want to do. But when I saw what was really involved, I did go out and meet people and give a little talking at the. They had some exhibit before the actual parade. Was that before or after? I don't even remember. Joe, I tell you, some of these things I do, but let's go on and move on.
Anything you want to say as we sort of wind the interview down? Anything else you would like to comment on or say?
Yes, I made some notes about a few things I wanted to mention. I started out in micro and ended up in macro. And I have a question about, is that valuable? Does that help to give you a better sense, a more detail, a deeper understanding of what happens on the front lines? So I felt very fortunate in that I started out micro, and like at the conference, the Leicester conference, that was part of what I learned there also, and how to switch roles. We had a guy, he was a psychologist who was a psychoanalyst. This guy switched roles according to the modality. He was the only one that did it. And these are all brilliant people. He was the only one, That's one question. I have some other comments, but I don't want to get into far. Another thing I think that, along the same lines, I think that social workers need to get better acquainted with systems theory, looking at how systems will push individuals, groups, towards certain behavior, towards certain phenomena. The other thing that I'm really big on, and that I feel is very helpful, even though it's usually applied to manufacturing, is just quality assurance. There are about 3 guys who developed theories about quality assurance. The Americans imbibed it first. One guy went to Japan. Japan started kicking the Americans' butt in manufacturing. Then the Americans took it up. But quality assurance theory has come up in several different applications in my conversations. Like I have a cousin who's a professor at Pace University in New York, and talked with him about it, about some issue he was dealing with. It's something people they should be exposed to, and I don't know if they are at present. The other thing I talked about is when you work in a corporate or in a bureaucratic structure, there's an informal network that carries the day, in my view. Either there's one there that you have to hook up to, or you have to develop one yourself. Just because you have facilities, design and construction over here, payroll over there, accounting over there, you have to figure out a network, because the network is individual people.
Yes.
A quick example, I went down to accounts payable when we first started, because somebody else was handling it, to find out what happens when I, want a bill paid. What's the process? As a result of that, to the day I retired, because they said, "What? You're the first department head who ever came down here. Who's ever interested in what we do?" Till the day I retired, I got excellent cooperation. Never, Bill, what do you want? Okay. So I think you have to not just look at the formal bureaucracy, but look at the informal structure within the organization. I even have an example from myself. I have a primary care physician, and only have I learned gradually that my cardiologist is my primary physician's patient. They know each other. My hematologist also knows my primary care. There's a pulmonologist I've seen over here at West LA. Guess what? My cardiologist, he tells me, when you see Dr. Collifer, make sure you tell him I said hello. Okay. Before I get out the door, he said, "Now remember, tell him I said hello." I go over to West LA to see Dr. Collifer. I say, "Oh, before I forget, Dr. Beck says blah, blah, blah." This guy's face changes. The code was look after this guy. That's the code. That's what I mean by informal network.
Have a better understanding of your success.
So yeah, I think that social workers, when they're starting out, need to think about not just their own personal network, but the network that exists within the company that helps to move whatever agenda is on the table. Has anybody thought about surveying what I call evolved MSW jobs? I'll define that in a minute. As they exist at present, so that that information can filter back to social work training. What I mean by evolved MSW jobs, kind of what you've been talking about, how you use MSW skills within a corporate setting. Because a lot of MSWs come into Kaiser, maybe working in traditional MSW jobs, but end up in other jobs somewhat related, but they're using their social work skills.
Yes.
So I don't know if anybody has looked at where have all the MSWs gone within.
Well, we used to talk to them about non-traditional social work jobs,
Right.
and having a student go down to one of the local cable networks for one of the local stations, and market their skills, not necessarily their degree. Yeah, I have a degree, but here are my
That's a good way to
skills.
put it.
So we have talked about it some, but I think what you're suggesting is a greater emphasis on that.
Yeah.
I think is called for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about it. Oh, I did want to say one thing that is not exactly related, but I don't have documentation, but I'll tell you what happened to me when I was overseas. I had a chance to sit in on a bunch of very experienced therapists in a group consultation with Anna Freud.
Wow.
Okay, and I was able to hear her evaluate the presentations, case presentations of experienced therapists. Another experience I had, I don't know if you're familiar with the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing, wrote a book
Heard his name.
called The Divided Self. Well, when I was living in London, Bob Lippman, who was medical director at Suicide Prevention Center, and he's a psychoanalyst, he came over and we both visited Lang's workshop in the East End of London, twice, I think, So those were two very rich experiences. Then I saw Laing when he came here, and he was at Esalen, and I was there, So in my career, those are two peak moments, and I don't have any way to document them.
Hey, you're documenting it's here right now on this video.
Yeah, but that, and I'll say this about my takeaway from observing Anna Freud. She looked like a little old lady that went to help across the street. When she opened her mouth, oh baby. And she controlled the whole process with a nod here, a nod there. Didn't say much until it was time for her to comment on somebody's presentation. And when she would sum up a case, I would be sitting there saying, and I heard the same thing she heard. But look what she took out of it. Number one, she was very clear how she interrelated material, which most people in the room missed. Okay? Her conclusions seemed to be always backed up with evidence in the material presented. It wasn't just wild speculation. As she was speculation, she was very clear about it. She was clear. But the main thing was that we got a bunch of people in this room, experience, and she comes up with stuff that none of us saw. So it's what you bring to the table. It's what you bring to the table.
You know, Bill, you've maximized your experiences, it sounds like. And what I know about you is you're still a learner. You're still open to learning. I know you're a teacher because when I see you, you offer me another book to read. And you've made just a major contribution to the Watts community, Los Angeles, to the profession of social work. And I've been honored to interview you. And I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this event. Much appreciated.
You're quite welcome, and thank you.